An opinion poll today confirmed support for the Greens in Victoria is at an historic high, boosting their optimism ahead of the November state election. Labor is worried about the prospect of the Greens grabbing a number of government-held seats in central Melbourne. And the Greens are talking up their power and influence in the event of a hung parliament here in Victoria. Almost 4 years ago, the Greens were celebrating a first in Victoria, representation in the state parliament. Last Saturday's historic election of a federal Greens MP to the House of Representatives has buoyed Victorian Greens, and they're hoping for even bigger things to come.
Well, in the instance where we have a balance of power situation, of course we'd like to have access to all the different levers of power simply to deliver the outcomes that our voters ask us to deliver. There's nothing unusual about that.
What is unusual in Victoria is the prospect that as many as 4 Greens could win lower house seats. There's also the suggestion that if they do hold the balance of power there, they want a share of it.
They're talking about the opening up of private members' time on the floor of the chamber, the role of committee systems, the independence of the Speaker. All these things are normally taken as the rewards of winning when you're Labor or the other guy, but in fact they can be shared in all sorts of ways to open up democracy and government.
The Greens also have their eyes on the transport portfolio.
I think it smacks of arrogance, and to say that they think they'll be in a coalition, that they've got their eyes on a particular portfolio, smacks of arrogance, and I think it'll be quite damaging to their brand.
He doesn't have to get personal about the Greens and talk about their arrogance. What he needs to do is explain how, if the Labor government sells its messages right, that the Greens are actually quite irrelevant in the state poll.
The Greens are on a roll, aren't they?
They're definitely on a roll. I think what's going to happen in the next few months in the lead up to the poll, now that their success is confirmed in the federal election, is the spotlight will come on them a lot brighter.
Greg Barber is the nominated spokesman for the 3 state Greens. He says up until now the Victorian government has treated them with disdain.
Labor took a real winner-take-all attitude to the upper house since the last election. For the first 3 years they refused point-blank every Greens amendment to a bill. Right? Blanket decision. We vote down every single Greens amendment. Recently that started to loosen up quite a bit, mainly because we're getting to the end of the parliamentary term and they need some legislation passed. I've never had a personal conversation with the Premier and neither of the other 2 Greens. I think I squeezed past him in a toilet in Parliament House once, but they've not been the sort of government who wanted to embrace the Greens and enter into a negotiation. Now, for the Greens coming in 2006, that was not what we were expecting and not what we were used to.
I think there's an element of brinkmanship, of course, going on now between both the Greens and the Labor Party, because they know they're in the contest for those seats. So we're likely to see some continuing, I think, aggression between both sides.
In the event of increasing their numbers at the state election, the Greens also want extra funding. Opposition parties are given funds for administrative costs.
John Brumby is the single biggest donor to the Liberal Party and National Party in Victoria because he gives them $1.5 million to run their opposition. The Greens get nothing. And by the way, when I asked him in Estimates Committee why that was, he looked me in the eye and said, "Talk to us how you cooperate with the legislative agenda."
Barrister Brian Walters is standing against Education Minister Bronwyn Pike in the marginal seat of Melbourne. He's a founding member of the Victorian Greens and is the one most likely to win a seat in the lower house. Unlike Adam Bant, who before the election declared his backing of Labor in a hung parliament, Mr Walters says he could work with either side of politics.
It remains to be seen. That's a completely hypothetical question, but the Greens have supported a Liberal government before. We did that from 1996 to 1998 in Tasmania. All options will be open and we won't shut any option off.
Mr Walters doesn't like his political views being labelled left or right.
Where does the environment fit on that left and right spectrum? Where does peace? Where does having accountable government? Where does grassroots democracy? Where do human rights fit? Left and right doesn't really work in relation to that. We're a progressive party and we'll talk to all parties and all members of Parliament.
Before even considering the state election, the Brumby government is faced with the prospect of a potentially damaging by-election. The sudden resignation of Ivanhoe Labor MP Craig Langdon could mean local residents are forced to vote in a by-election just weeks before the November state election. But the constituents of Ivanhoe may be spared having to vote 3 times in 3 months. Constitutional experts say there is a precedent where the issuing of writs for a general election can override a writ already issued for a by-election. And Stateline requested an interview with Bronwyn Pike, the current member for Melbourne, but she was unavailable.